With 5 kids, a wife, a television production company, 2 active full-time ministries, and time alone with the Lord, I don't get an awful lot of free time, but occasionally I do get to slip out on a boat into the Gulf of Mexico down here in the Keys and enjoy the hobby of spearfishing. Now, I'll be the first to admit it's kind of a strange recreational pursuit. I mean, the idea is you drive about 6 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico and try to locate, using one of these electronic GPS units, various coral rock holes in about 6 to 8 feet of water. And once you spot the holes from the boat, you stop, anchor, and swim up on them. And usually you can spot 1 or 2 nice-sized groupers. And of course, the objective is to attempt to harvest the fish by using a spear gun. Now, my wife thinks that's a little crazy. I mean, I suppose she considers it all well and good, at least for me. But as for her, when it comes to her choice of personal recreation, she likes creative memories, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the hobby of creating those relatively elaborate photo albums with all kinds of decorative trim and cutouts and stickers and so on. And I gotta say, I'm not sure I can see what pleasure she gets out of cutting and pasting little pictures and borders onto a photo album for 2 hours straight. In fact, I think it would drive me nuts. But on the other hand, I suppose it's no stranger than getting a thrill out of shooting a fish. But here's the point. For both of us, our choice of recreation is a matter of personal opinion, isn't it? Within obvious moral limits, there's no real right or wrong when it comes to recreation. She says tomato, I say tomato, and that's fine. But what isn't so fine is if, for example, your pharmacist decided to start interpreting your medical prescriptions based purely on personal opinion. Can you imagine that scenario? Let's say your physician writes you out a prescription for cough medicine, and then you take that prescription to your local pharmacist, and he gives you an antibiotic because that's his personal favorite. And then a week later, you try a second pharmacist, and for the same cough prescription, he gives you this time an antidepressant because his personal interpretation of the prescription for cough medicine is a little more open-minded and based on free association instead of what the prescribing doctor actually wrote. Would you be okay with that? Would you think that's a good thing? Of course not. The philosophy of using personal opinion to address things that are objective, not subjective, can be pretty dangerous, wouldn't you agree? And that's why I'm always amazed at how gullible and willing people are to buy into the misconception that interpreting the Bible is somehow a matter of personal opinion. That is an insane proposition, especially when you consider that the ramifications of being wrong about the Bible have eternal consequences. Biblical interpretation is not like picking a part-time recreation. Part-time recreations are a matter of personal preference, and so is art. Art is another example of something that's very subjective. Take, for example, this multi-million-dollar Van Gogh painting. I personally think it looks like my 6-year-old daughter painted it. In fact, she did paint the one that you're looking at right now. And if it were up to me, I'd hang that one on the wall of my home, not the multi-million-dollar Van Gogh. But again, I suppose that's a matter of personal opinion. And personal opinion, at least when it comes to things like recreational pursuits and art and clothing and colors and taste and food and so on, well, all that's a good thing. We should rejoice in and nurture our differences as human beings because God made us different. And by the grace of God, we as Americans live in a country where we can express and enjoy those differences of opinion. But our culture today, and I am referring now to even many Christians, now want to start treating even Holy Scripture that way. Many people are trying to insist that we should interpret Scripture as each of us sees fit, which would be a little like telling the police officer on Interstate 95 that his interpretation of the speed limit is good for him, but you've decided to drive 110 miles an hour today. because we're all different after all, and anybody who feels otherwise is simply being intolerant. Well, as ridiculous perhaps as all of those scenarios sound, that is, in essence, what many people, even Christians, are trying to do with biblical interpretation. They want to interpret the Bible based on personal feelings or subjective opinion, even when those opinions disagree with the facts. And while I agree that there's nothing more arrogant on a subjective matter than to insist that your own personal opinion is the only right one, it is also true that there are few things more ignorant than to insist on having a personal subjective opinion on something that's not subjective at all. And biblical interpretation is objective, not subjective. God has said what He meant, and He has meant what He said. So our job is to identify His meaning in Scripture, not base it on our own subjective feelings and opinions. In fact, the whole idea behind having the Bible in the first place is so that we can move out of the realm of what we may think is right pertaining to the subjects of God, morality, and religion, and instead get down to the actual facts by reading a Bible verse or passage in context